I'm delighted to welcome Kris Grimonprez, who is visiting professor at KU Leuven on EU citizenship education in the Faculty of Law. Kris, thank you so much for being here, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, how to practice common values in a living democracy. In these challenging times in Europe, EU values are our compass, but we have to educate for them, and we have to discuss them, yes, also in hard cases. Therefore, at this wonderful occasion of the celebration of the Jean Monnet Action, I am grateful to tell you some stories, real-life stories. Look at the goddess of justice, with her sword, the rule of law, and what will interest us today, always with a set of scales. How to balance interests, rights, and values, Jim, indeed central to my talk. As an EU lawyer, I have selected court cases, looking for the story of citizens behind the case. We identify EU rules and rights, but to allow non-lawyers to work with our cases, we go deeper, and we point to the underlying EU objectives, EU principles, and finally to the EU values. They form the DNA of the EU, or what Montesquieu would call l'esprit des lois. Our stories are based on case law of the Court of Justice of the European Union in Luxembourg. I therefore propose that we first listen to a message of the president of that court, Koen Lenaerts.
Ladies and gentlemen, I warmly congratulate the Jean Monnet Action for its 35th anniversary. Thank you for the important work done by the Commission and by all participants. The opportunities the Jean Monnet Action offers are crucial for our European project, and I see an important future for it. Not only higher education needs learning and reflection about the EU, but school education too. Democracy presupposes that all citizens have an enlightened understanding of the system in which they live. Therefore, in the present state of EU law, quality education is no longer possible without an adequate EU dimension in education. The mobile citizens and the static citizens, who are the large majority of young people who remain at home, all citizens have a right to education for democratic citizenship and human rights education, aligned on the EU treaties and the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU. This charter fleshes out our common values. The Leuven University project, Case4EU, has developed valuable materials to practice these values in a living democracy. These common values can be practiced at school. Thank you, and I wish you success in all your endeavors.
Case4EU started as a Jean Monnet project at KU Leuven. Case teaching about EU rights and values in secondary schools, empowering for active citizenship. It had a structural impact with the creation of 2 new university courses on EU citizenship education, also in teacher training. Here is one of the messages to EU citizens.
Because the EU is founded on the rule of law, you can enforce any EU right in court, even against your own country. The stories of EU citizens fighting for their rights in court teach you what the EU stands for and make you think. Citizens refusing to put up with unhealthy air in Brussels forced the Brussels government to act by invoking EU environmental rules. An air hostess defended her EU right to equal pay for equal work and won her case against a major airline. A student defended his right to personal data protection and won against Facebook. French tourists in Romania invoked their right to equal treatment and paid the same museum entry fee as Romanians. EU citizens belong to a union based on common values: respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, respect for human rights, pluralism, tolerance, and solidarity.
Beautiful values. There's consensus about them until we have to practice them. Human dignity is questioned in the Hagbin case, the story of the young Afghan, a judgment of 2019. Hagbin is a boy, not yet 18. He arrives alone in Belgium, fleeing the war in Afghanistan, an unaccompanied minor. He applies for international protection, but in his accommodation center in Belgium, the police must regularly intervene because Hagbin is violent. He starts fights. In the end, Fedazil says, "Now it is enough, out." Hagbin is excluded from the center for 2 weeks. He has to sleep in parks. His Belgian guardian goes to court and says, "You cannot just put him on the street. His human dignity must be respected and the best interests of the child." Belgium replies, "I must be able to impose sanctions for serious acts of violence. We are responsible for safety in the accommodation center." A side note, I have brought for each of you a huge book. I hope you have received it when you registered. The Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, an extra small format, but an extra large content. As you know, Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union lists the EU values, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights fleshes them out. It gives you rights which you can defend in court. Article 1 says that human dignity is inviolable, and that in all actions, the child's best interests must be a primary consideration. Legal bases in the treaties allow for further explicitation of these values in EU legislation. Well, human dignity was at the heart of the Reception Directive, laying down standards for reception of applicants for international protection. It requires member states to provide housing, food, and clothing. What would you decide as a judge? Human dignity or sanctions for serious violence? In its decision, the court gives more weight to human dignity, interpreting the Reception Directive. Why? An important tool to practice common values and to balance different values or objectives is the proportionality test. Restrictions to EU rights are justified if there is a legitimate aim, an objective of general interest, and if they are proportionate. Measures cannot go beyond what is necessary to reach the objectives, and that depends on the concrete circumstances of the case. Such stories are therefore occasions to practice common values in education. Applied here, sanctioning violent behavior is a legitimate aim, but putting a minor out on the street for 2 weeks is disproportionate, not necessary. Hagbin could have been sanctioned in other ways, says the court, like isolating him in a part of the center. Hagbin wins, Belgium loses. It shows the value of the rule of law. Also, member states' authorities must respect fundamental rights. Moreover, the interpretation of the Reception Directive in Hagbin must be uniformly applied In all member states, they must all guarantee a dignified standard of living for asylum seekers. Let's dive into the value of freedom with the Schmidberger case, the story of the environmental protesters on the motorway. Schmidberger runs a transport company in Germany and has a contract to deliver wood in Italy at an exactly agreed time. His 5 lorries advance well, but then it happens. At the Brenner Pass, the border between Austria and Italy, they are forced to stop. There is a manifestation on the highway of a Tyrol environmental association complaining about the heavy traffic threatening nature and health. Schmidberger is stuck for 30 hours. He arrives in Italy way too late and claims damages from Austria. He invokes a fundamental freedom in the EU, free movement of goods. No obstacles at borders. But Austria says, I have authorized that demonstration because I respect the right to freedom of expression and the right to demonstrate of the association. I am sure not all of you would agree here. Should free movement of goods prevail, the economic objectives of a good functioning internal market, firmly anchored in the treaties, or should more weight be given to freedom of expression, essential in a democracy, and firmly anchored in the Charter? Again, to strike the balance, we need the proportionality test. To restrict the free movement of goods, the legitimate aim here is allowing freedom of expression of the citizens. And in the concrete circumstances, the court decided that Austria had a proportional measure and did not go beyond what was necessary. There had been extensive information before the manifestation took place. Schmidberger could have known. He lost the case, Austria won. To practice the value of equality, I will tell you the story of the vacancies. Pascal Ferrein, a Belgian employer, wants to hire new workers to install garage doors, but he declares on television that he will not recruit Moroccans. The Center for Equal Opportunities says this is discrimination based on ethnic origin, forbidden by the EU. But Ferrein answers, my customers don't want Moroccans. My company installs garage doors in private houses, often villas, and they don't want Moroccans entering their homes. I must comply with their requirements. Moreover, I didn't discriminate because I didn't reject anyone individually. Here you see how problems of citizens arrive before the Court of Justice. They always bring their dispute to their national court. If that court hesitates on the interpretation of an EU rule, it asks a preliminary question to the Court of Luxembourg. And it is with that answer that finally the national court will decide the case. And in this case, the court applies the Racial Equality Directive and decides there is discrimination. The center wins, Ferrein loses. To practice common values with students in our learning activities, we do not fear to ask provocative questions. The customer is king, is he not? What to do when he doesn't want Moroccans? And what about the freedom of the employer to conduct a business? Stories allow to experience values and lead to reflection. In which society do we want to live? I invite you to read Article 21 in the huge book. In this constitutional text, we have agreed on non-discrimination, not on grounds of sex, race, color, ethnic origin, disability, age, or sexual orientation. As is pictured in our clip, we all have a duty of non-discrimination. What about solidarity? Elisabetta Dano and her son Florin are Romanians living in Leipzig. Elisabetta has never worked and she's not looking for a job, although she is able to work. She asks for social benefits in Germany, the same as the German citizens. Invoking her right to free movement of persons in the EU and equal treatment irrespective of nationality, indeed treaty rights. The Job Center in Leipzig says, no, that could become an unreasonable burden on the social assistance system of the host country. Elisabetta Dano loses the case. To keep solidarity in the EU sustainable, we need to circumscribe the group of persons who can benefit from it. And that is what the legislator has done in the Free Movement Directive, setting conditions and limitations. There is no automatic right to equal social benefits in EU member states, but as appears in the story of the mother fleeing domestic violence, there's always the safety net of the Charter, respect for human dignity and the child's best interests. The three core EU values are the rule of law, democracy, and fundamental rights, human rights. We can practice human rights in the Google Spain case. Mario Coseja González, a Spanish businessman, is unhappy because a Google search on his name leads to an old newspaper article about his former debts. He asks Google to remove that information because he paid off that debt ages ago and the information is no longer of any interest. He invokes his right to protection of personal data and to private life. Mario wants to be forgotten on the internet. Google Spain, assisted by Google United States, refuses. We have an economic interest to give the public all search results. There is freedom of information. Here we have to balance human rights against one another. What prevails? The right to respect for private life and to protection of personal data, or the freedom of expression and information? The court rules in favor of private life, and the right to forgotten is born. Yet, in certain cases, access to information must weigh more heavily. And in a living democracy, the last word goes to the legislator. The European Parliament and the Council have adopted the GDPR, specifying conditions. My last story illustrates democracy and the rule of law. Volker and Markus Schecke are German farmers who receive EU financial aid. Great, but their names and the precise amount what they receive are published on the website of their Land Hesse, and they are uncomfortable with hostile reactions in their neighborhood. They ask respect for their private life and of personal data. In defense, the German Land Hesse points to a rule of the Council and European Commission obliging them to publish it. So you have a balancing. The aim here is transparency in the use of EU agricultural funds, essential for democracy. Public control on the money reinforces accountability. There is a fundamental right to freedom of information. There is thus a legitimate aim to restrict privacy rights. But the court decides that it was disproportionate to publish all the data and the precise amounts for natural persons. The court declared the EU rules partly invalid, and new rules had to be adopted to create a proper balance, respecting the fundamental rights in a living democracy. The value of the rule of law means that law is the basis for the exercise of public authority. Everyone must respect the law. Member states, as we saw in Hackbin, citizens, as we saw in the Verein case, big companies, as in Google, and EU institutions, as in the Schecke case. To conclude, like all learning, EU learning too should be objective and critical and pluralistic. Objectivity can be guaranteed by aligning teaching about the EU on the EU treaties and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. That is no EU propaganda. That is constitutional literacy, providing knowledge, be it abstract. One tool for critical and pluralistic learning is case teaching, where skills as problem solving and nuanced thinking are exercised in concrete situations, practicing common values. The final objective is to empower EU citizens. Working with court cases automatically leads to multi-perspectivity. Every party may have good arguments, and they allow interesting debates with students in higher education and in secondary education. Case teaching may therefore build a preventive shield against populism, extremism, and one-liners. You can find more information on the Case4EU website. Please help us to disseminate a clip, EU Citizen Does It Matter, in your member state. It is available in 26 languages. Together, we are responsible for democracy, peace, and well-being in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kris. Please do come and join me. Fascinating, and it would have been interesting to know how people's thinking was going, as you were saying. What would you do if you were the judge? I just wanted to ask you, I think Case4EU began as a Jean Monnet project, and we heard there from the president of the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, how important he thought they were. For you, how important was that impetus provided by Jean Monnet actions for this project?
That impetus was crucial. It really opened doors. KU Leuven, I think every university, when you come in with a project with some money, they take you seriously, a lot of doors open, and they really had a look at it and were amazed about the impact of the EU in daily life. So I said, we have to educate our students, not only in bachelor's level, but especially the multipliers for EU learning, and that are the teachers. My timer. Teachers are the multipliers. Teachers in secondary schools especially can explain what is the EU and can also accompany critical thinking about it. So it has now been integrated in teacher training.
And of course, it used to be that Jean Monnet actions were very much focused on higher education. Now, of course, they extend to schools, to vocational education and training institutions. So it has broadened. When you take that approach, would you say that when you apply it, when teachers apply it in the classroom, they do it in the same way as they would at the bachelor level? Or what's the most effective way to do that with younger students?
I think the cases trigger interest. They really awaken a classroom who is half asleep about the story of Schmidberger and who would you let win, and they immediately get in discussion. And I think that bottom up, starting with a very concrete case, you can give the knowledge and the insight in the DNA of the EU, free movement of goods, the internal market, but the EU is not only an economic union, you also have freedom of expression, you have other objectives. So I think cases are very interesting to start, but I didn't invent anything because case teaching is used in universities, in law, all the time. I only have tried to make it more, to simplify it more and ready to use in secondary schools.
And of course, Jean Monnet actions they're about, of course, supporting teaching and learning and research, but they're also about promoting the debate. And we're going to hear a little bit later about promoting active citizenship, and Pia was talking about citizenship education to make us active citizens. Do you think that discussion that goes around when you say, okay, you're the judge, how do you do this? Is that debate for you? You said it isn't propaganda. You said, I like the word you use, constitutional literacy. How important is that discussion about if you were the judge, what would you do as part of this approach?
I think it forces them to reflect. Because you can say, these are the competences of the Commission and of the Parliament and that many members, all the institutional knowledge, or you can say in that year you have the coal and steel community. That is EU learning, but it's not enough. I think we have to go deeper to the DNA, to the principles, the objectives, the values, and precisely to these discussions. In what kind of union do they want to live? A union with non-discrimination, but what are the implications? Will you give really the same social benefits to everybody who's coming from other countries to a richer country? How do you balance? So I think it makes them think, and they understand better what is the EU.
And could also be applied, I mean, we're talking here about thinking about the law and how the law is interpreted, but it could be applied right across the spectrum of different projects in different areas, couldn't it? This is a methodology you can use to get that discussion going.
Yeah.
Here's the dilemma. One conversation we often have in Brussels is about, do we talk about trade-offs enough?
Yes.
Do we talk about, you can do one thing in one area, but the consequence in another? So I'm seeing a potential here for really good discussion about the trade-offs that citizens may not be aware of when policymakers make decisions.
Sure, we have in Dutch now some 40, 50 cases. It's being translated to English, but we have 8 modules also in environment, digital transformation, social rights, consumer protection, migration, etc. So in a lot of fields, we need the same skills of thinking critically, but first having the information. And I think that stories can be a good way, especially for those who remain at home, who are the static citizens. We need to educate them all, not only the ones who are lucky and go on Erasmus, but the large majority at home is not aware of what is the EU. And I think such stories are an interesting tool.
So we promised you some inspiration. We had great inspiration when we looked at the big challenges facing the EU and what to do, and great inspiration for the sort of projects that can really make a difference. Will you join me in thanking Kris very much indeed? That was super, Kris. Thank you very much.